Welcome to Books in 10. Remember, we're raffling an iPhone when we reach 10,000 subscribers. Like, subscribe, and journey with us into this fantastic book. Share with your friends, and let's create the biggest book community on YouTube together. Oh, there's a link to purchase the book in the pinned comments. Enjoy. We are accepting book requests to create content within. Suggest the best titles in the comments. Now let's go. All right, today we're diving deep into Tolstoy's Givell, The Kingdom of God is Within You. This book really stirred the pot back in 1894 when it was published.
Yeah, it was so controversial it was even banned in his home country, Russia.
Yeah, banned. Wow. What was it about this book that caused such a strong reaction?
Well, Tolstoy took direct aim at the establishment, like challenging conventional thinking on Christianity,
Okay.
pacifism, and even the role of government.
Yeah.
His ideas were considered quite radical,
Yeah.
even dangerous by many at the time.
So let's unpack some of these radical ideas. The core of the book seems to be this concept of non-resistance to evil by force. What exactly did Tolstoy mean by that?
It's a fascinating concept, and it's often misunderstood.
Yeah.
Tolstoy's non-resistance isn't about being passive or simply giving in to evil.
Right.
He actually defines it as not opposing violence with violence,
Okay.
drawing heavily on the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount.
So if it's not passive, how does one actively practice this non-resistance?
Tolstoy argued for actively resisting evil, but through moral and spiritual means.
Okay.
He believed that true change wouldn't come from fighting fire with fire, but from a fundamental shift in our consciousness, in our understanding of life itself.
He was calling for an internal revolution, not an external one.
Exactly. He saw a lot of hypocrisy in the way institutions, especially religious ones, dealt with violence.
Right.
For example, he was fiercely critical of those who interpreted the Sermon on the Mount as just a set of nice-sounding ideals, but not a practical guide for living.
Yeah.
He pointed to specific passages like, "Resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also," and argued that Christians weren't taking these teachings seriously enough.
But isn't turning the other cheek just inviting more abuse? It sounds almost naive.
That's a common criticism, and it's one Tolstoy addressed head-on.
Okay.
He argued that turning the other cheek wasn't about weakness or submission, but about breaking the cycle of violence. It's about refusing to play by the rules of a system that perpetuates aggression and retaliation.
So instead of meeting violence with violence, what did Tolstoy propose as an alternative?
He believed in the power of love, compassion, and forgiveness to overcome evil.
Yeah.
He argued that by responding to violence with these qualities, we could disarm our enemies and ultimately transform their hearts.
It sounds very idealistic, especially in a world that often seems to reward aggression and self-interest.
It is idealistic, but Tolstoy wasn't naive about the challenges. He saw modern society as riddled with contradictions, especially among educated people.
Yeah.
He wrote about how they recognized the horrors of war, but then failed to offer any real alternatives, ultimately perpetuating the cycle of violence.
So where did he see this hypocrisy playing out in the real world?
He pointed to things like mandatory military service, arguing that it forced individuals to violate their conscience and participate in state violence. He felt governments used the threat of external enemies to justify huge armies, but that these armies were often used to control their own people more than anything else.
He saw this inherent contradiction between what people believed and how they actually behaved.
Exactly. Tolstoy felt that churches, particularly the Russian Orthodox Church, were obscuring the true meaning of Christianity by focusing on rituals and dogmas rather than the core message of love and nonviolence.
Like he's saying they're missing the forest for the trees.
He used some pretty powerful examples to illustrate his point.
Okay.
He talked about writers like Guy de Maupassant and Edouard Rod, who saw war as undeniably brutal but also inevitable.
Yeah.
Then you had figures like Academician de Vogue, who believed war was actually beneficial, a necessary evil for progress.
It seems like he was deeply troubled by this sense of resignation, this acceptance of violence, as a natural part of the human condition.
He was. And he believed it stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of Christ's teachings.
Okay.
He argued that the true essence of Christianity lay in the radical call to love our enemies,
Yeah.
to forgive those who trespass against us, and to refuse to participate in any form of violence.
Okay.
He saw this message as revolutionary,
Yeah.
not in a political sense,
Right.
but in a deeply personal and spiritual one.
A revolution of the heart, so to speak.
Precisely.
Okay.
And he believed that this individual transformation, this awakening to the truth of Christ's message, was the only way to create lasting change in the world.
It's a very powerful idea, but also a very challenging one.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problems he's describing, and to question whether individual actions can truly make a difference. What would you say to someone struggling with that sense of doubt?
That's where Tolstoy's example comes in. Remember, he didn't just preach these ideas. He lived them. He renounced his wealth and privilege, choosing to live a simpler life in line with his beliefs. He worked alongside peasants, advocated for animal rights, and founded a school where he taught children about love and nonviolence.
So he walked the walk, so to speak.
He did, and he faced a lot of criticism and backlash for it.
Yeah.
He was even excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church.
Wow.
But his life is a testament to the power of individual conviction
Yeah.
and the courage it takes to live by one's principles, even in the face of opposition.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in the theoretical discussions about non-resistance, but ultimately it's about how we choose to live our lives, the choices we make every day.
Exactly. And that's what makes Tolstoy's work so relevant even today. He's not just offering a critique of society.
Yeah.
He's inviting us to look inward,
Okay.
to examine our own beliefs and behaviors, and to ask ourselves how we can be part of the solution, not the problem.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore Tolstoy's ideas about free will and how he believed individuals could overcome the conditioning of their environment and societal pressures to make choices that align with their conscience.
We left off talking about Tolstoy living his truth and challenging us to do the same. And that leads perfectly into another key point he makes in The Kingdom of God is Within You.
Okay, what's that?
He challenges the very idea that man is not free to transform his life.
Interesting. In what way?
Well, back then and even often today, the common belief was that we are essentially products of our environment, our upbringing, maybe even our genetics.
Like we're just cogs in a machine,
Yeah.
not really in control of our destiny.
Exactly. But Tolstoy argued that while our actions might be influenced by external factors, our ability to recognize and acknowledge the truth is entirely within our control. We can choose to see the world as it is, to see the hypocrisy,
Yeah.
the violence, the injustice.
So it's about waking up, becoming aware of the truth, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yes. And Tolstoy was very clear that this awakening, this shift in consciousness, is the key to true freedom. He even outlines 3 ways humans relate to truth.
I'm curious about these 3 ways. What are they?
First, there's ignoring the truth, pretending it doesn't exist.
Right?
Think of someone who witnesses injustice but chooses to look the other way because it's easier to maintain their comfort.
Right.
Second, there's acknowledging the truth but failing to act on it. Maybe someone feels sympathy for those suffering, but they don't do anything to help, perhaps out of fear or apathy. Finally, there's recognizing the truth and allowing it to guide your actions. This is where true change begins, where we move beyond awareness and into action.
It sounds like Tolstoy is saying that awareness without action is ultimately meaningless.
He is. He believed that true freedom lies not just in recognizing the truth, but in letting it guide our choices and behaviors. This, he argued, is how we break free from the shackles of delusion and align ourselves with a higher purpose.
So it's not just about seeing things differently, but about living differently as a result.
Right. And that can be incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It can be scary to challenge the status quo, to step outside of our comfort zones and act according to our conscience. That's why Tolstoy placed so much emphasis on individual courage and the willingness to defy social norms and expectations.
But didn't he also say we're not truly free in our actions? That seems to contradict his call for us to choose a different path.
That's a great point. Tolstoy wasn't suggesting we have control over every external circumstance. Instead, he was talking about aligning our will with a higher purpose, with what he called the kingdom of God within you.
Okay.
It's about choosing to participate in the unfolding of a more just and loving world, even if we can't dictate all the details.
So it's about surrendering to a truth that's bigger than our individual ego and desires.
Yes. It's about recognizing that we are part of something larger than ourselves and acting in accordance with that understanding. Tolstoy believed that aligning ourselves with this truth, with this higher purpose, gives us access to a different kind of power, a spiritual power that can move mountains, even if it doesn't always look the way we expect.
It's not about brute force or control, but about tapping into a force that's ultimately more powerful.
Exactly. And he saw this force at work in the lives of countless individuals throughout history. People who were willing to defy the conventions of their time and stand up for what they believed in, even when it meant facing persecution or imprisonment.
He saw them as living examples of this internal transformation he was calling for.
He did. He saw them as pioneers paving the way for a new understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to live in accordance with our highest principles.
It's a powerful message, but it also raises a lot of questions. For example, how do we know what the truth is? What if our understanding of the truth is flawed or incomplete?
That's where Tolstoy's emphasis on individual conscience comes in. He believed that the truth isn't something that's imposed from the outside, but something that's discovered within each of us through a process of deep introspection and reflection. He saw conscience as an inner compass, a guide that could help us navigate the complexities of life and discern right from wrong.
So it's about listening to that inner voice, trusting our intuition, even when it challenges conventional wisdom or societal norms.
He believed that if we quiet the noise of the external world and truly listen to our conscience, we would discover the truth that's already within us. And that truth, he argued, would always lead us towards love, compassion, and nonviolence.
But what about the role of reason and critical thinking? How does that fit into Tolstoy's framework?
Tolstoy wasn't advocating for blind faith or unquestioning obedience. He believed that reason and critical thinking were essential tools for discerning the truth, for separating truth from falsehood, and for challenging dogma and blind authority. He argued that true faith wasn't about accepting things blindly, but about questioning, exploring, and constantly striving for a deeper understanding.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. He saw life as a constant process of learning, growing, and evolving. He believed that we should never stop questioning, never stop seeking truth, never stop striving to align ourselves with our highest principles.
But what about those who simply refuse to acknowledge the truth, even when it's staring them in the face? How do we deal with those who are willfully ignorant or choose to perpetuate systems of violence and oppression?
That's where Tolstoy's belief in the transformative power of love and forgiveness comes in. He argued that even those who seem most lost, most entrenched in darkness, are capable of change. He believed that by responding to their hatred with love, their violence with forgiveness, we could plant the seeds of transformation in their hearts.
It sounds incredibly difficult, almost impossible to love those who have wronged us or who are actively causing harm in the world.
It is difficult, but Tolstoy believed it was the only way to break the cycle of violence and create lasting change. He recognized the human tendency towards revenge and retaliation, but he argued that those impulses ultimately lead to more suffering, not less.
He saw love and forgiveness as the only path to true healing and reconciliation.
He did. And he didn't just preach these ideas, he tried to live them out in his own life. He was known for his generosity and compassion, even towards those who had wronged him. He believed that every human being, no matter how flawed, deserved love and understanding.
So how does this individual transformation, this awakening to the truth, translate to societal change? How did Tolstoy envision a world where these principles of non-resistance could actually govern our relationships and institutions?
That's a question he grapples with throughout the book. He believed that once a critical mass of individuals embraced this Christian conception of life, this commitment to love, forgiveness, and non-resistance, it would create a ripple effect, gradually transforming the very fabric of society.
So it's a bottom-up approach, a grassroots movement of sorts.
He uses a compelling analogy to illustrate this point.
Okay.
He compares it to a swarm of bees clinging to a branch. They're in a precarious position, and they need to find a new home. But they can't all take flight at once. One bee hinders another. However, each bee has wings and the capacity to fly.
So it's about each individual recognizing their own agency, their own power to break free from the hive mind and take that leap of faith.
Precisely. And as more and more individuals make that leap, the old structures of violence and oppression begin to lose their hold. He saw this happening in the acts of conscientious objectors refusing military service, in individuals refusing to pay taxes that funded war. He believed these seemingly small acts of defiance were cracks in the foundation of state authority.
It's like each act of noncompliance plants a seed for a different kind of future.
And Tolstoy believed that as public opinion shifted, governments would be forced to change. He envisioned a world where armies become obsolete, where courts rely on principles of restorative justice rather than punishment, where the exploitation of the poor and marginalized becomes unthinkable.
It's a pretty radical vision, especially considering the world he was living in.
It was radical then, and it's still radical now. But what's important is that Tolstoy doesn't present it as a utopian fantasy. He recognizes the challenges, the fear of the unknown, the resistance from those who benefit from the current system.
But he also believed that this transformation was not only possible, but inevitable.
He did. He saw it as part of the natural evolution of humanity, a movement towards a higher consciousness, a more enlightened way of being in the world.
So in a sense, he was calling for a revolution, but not one fought with weapons and armies.
Exactly. He was advocating for a revolution of the heart, a revolution of consciousness. And he believed that this individual transformation was not only possible, but essential for creating a more just and peaceful world.
It's a powerful and challenging message, one that invites us to look beyond the limitations of our current reality and imagine a future where love and nonviolence are not just ideals, but the guiding principles of human society.
And that brings us to another important aspect of Tolstoy's philosophy, his critique of hypocrisy.
Okay.
He argued that hypocrisy allows us to turn a blind eye to the violence and injustice we're complicit in. It allows us to maintain our comfort and complacency while others suffer.
So it's not just about changing our own behavior, but about calling out the hypocrisy we see around us.
He believed that exposing hypocrisy was crucial for dismantling the systems of violence and oppression that rely on our complicity. He challenged us to see through the lies we tell ourselves and each other, to recognize the disconnect between our stated values and our actual behavior.
It's about being honest with ourselves, first and foremost, and then holding others accountable for their actions as well.
He saw hypocrisy as a disease that infected every level of society, from the highest echelons of power to the most ordinary interactions between individuals. He argued that we all have a responsibility to confront it, to speak truth to power, and to live in a way that reflects our deepest values.
It's a tall order, but it's also incredibly empowering to think that we have that kind of agency, that we can be part of something bigger than ourselves.
That's the beauty of Tolstoy's message. He doesn't shy away from the challenges, but he also offers a profound sense of hope. He reminds us that we're not alone in this struggle, that there's a force greater than ourselves that's working through us, guiding us towards a more just and compassionate future.
All right, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation so far.
Yeah.
I think we'll pause here for now. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the practical implications of Tolstoy's ideas and consider what they might mean for our own lives, for the choices we make every day. We'll also delve into how he addressed some of the common anxieties people have about a world without violence and state control. So we spent the last two parts of our deep dive really unpacking Tolstoy's radical ideas about non-resistance, the hypocrisy of modern society, and the individual's role in creating change. He painted a pretty stark picture of the world and the systems we live in.
Yeah, he did. But even though his critique was sharp, I think the key takeaway is that Tolstoy believed a genuine transformation was possible, even amidst the darkness and violence he saw all around him.
It's easy to get, I guess, bogged down in the problems, so that glimmer of hope is important. Where did Tolstoy think this transformation would begin?
He didn't believe it would come from top-down reforms or sweeping political revolution. For Tolstoy, it had to start with each individual, with a change in consciousness. He called it finding the kingdom of God within.
So less about changing the world around us and more about changing ourselves first.
Exactly. And that leads us to some more practical questions. How did Tolstoy actually live out these principles in his own life?
Right.
How did he bridge the gap between lofty ideals and everyday actions?
That's a good question. It's one thing to write about these things, but quite another to actually embody them.
Right, and Tolstoy's life is a fascinating example of someone trying to do just that.
Okay.
Here's a man born into wealth and privilege, an aristocrat, who ultimately renounced it all to live a simpler life in accordance with his beliefs.
That's a pretty drastic step. What did that look like in practice?
He believed in the dignity of manual labor, so he worked alongside the peasants on his estate, getting his hands dirty.
Wow.
He was also a strong advocate for animal rights and became a vegetarian. And he was deeply passionate about education, founding a school for peasant children where he taught them about love, compassion, and nonviolence.
It sounded like he was trying to create a microcosm of the society he envisioned.
Absolutely. He was attempting to live out his ideals, not just theorize about them. And of course, this led to conflict. He became a vocal critic of the Russian Orthodox Church, challenging their authority and interpretations of the scriptures, which ultimately got him excommunicated.
He wasn't winning any popularity contests with the establishment.
No, he wasn't. He was also outspoken against war and militarism, which made him a controversial figure even among those who admired his literary genius.
Right.
But throughout all the pushback and criticism, he remained committed to his principles, believing that true happiness stemmed not from material wealth or social status, but from aligning oneself with truth and the principles of love and non-resistance.
His life was a powerful testament to his convictions. But I think for many people, these ideas, while noble, can feel daunting or impractical in the real world. What would you say to someone who admires Tolstoy's vision but struggles to see how they could possibly apply it to their own life?
I think Tolstoy would say it's not about achieving some perfect state of non-resistance all at once. It's about the daily choices we make, the small acts of kindness and compassion, the moments where we choose love over fear, forgiveness over resentment, even when it's difficult.
So it's those little things, those seemingly insignificant choices that can add up to something bigger.
Exactly. Every time we resist the urge to retaliate, to judge harshly, or to perpetuate systems of harm, we're contributing to that shift in consciousness that Tolstoy believed was so essential. He saw these individual acts as seeds being planted, gradually transforming the soil of human society.
It's about recognizing that we're not powerless, that each of us has a role to play in shaping the world around us. But what about those larger systemic issues? The wars, the poverty, the injustice. How can individuals hope to make a dent in those seemingly insurmountable problems?
Well, remember the analogy of the bees on the branch. Each bee taking flight on its own might seem insignificant, but as more and more bees do the same, eventually the entire swarm shifts. Tolstoy believed the same principle applied to societal change. As more and more individuals choose to live by their conscience, to resist violence and injustice, to act from a place of love and compassion, the old systems begin to crumble.
It creates some momentum, a force for change that can't be ignored.
Precisely. And he points to historical examples of this throughout the book. The early Christians who refused to renounce their faith, the abolitionists who fought to end slavery, the individuals who stood up to totalitarian regimes. These were all people who, through their individual acts of courage and resistance, helped to shift the course of history.
It's inspiring, but also, I think, a little intimidating. It makes you wonder, am I doing enough? Am I living up to these ideals?
I think that's a natural question to ask, and Tolstoy would likely say that the very act of asking that question, of reflecting on our choices and seeking to align ourselves with a higher purpose, is a sign that we're on the right track. It's about the journey, the continual striving, not about achieving some perfect state of being.
So it's more about intention and direction than about reaching a specific destination.
Yes, it's about moving towards the light, even if we stumble along the way. And remember, Tolstoy also acknowledged that there would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. He didn't present this as a path devoid of difficulty.
But he did believe that the journey itself was worthwhile, that the pursuit of a more just and loving world was a fight worth fighting.
Absolutely. And he believed that the greatest obstacle to this transformation wasn't external forces or oppressive systems, but our own fear, our own complacency, our own unwillingness to let go of the familiar, even when it's causing us harm. He challenged us to confront those fears, to step outside of our comfort zones, and to embrace the unknown, trusting that a force greater than ourselves would guide us.
It's a call to both individual and collective awakening.
It is, and I think it's a message that resonates deeply today, perhaps even more so than in Tolstoy's time. We live in a world that often feels overwhelmed by violence, division, and despair. But Tolstoy reminds us that we're not powerless, that we each have the capacity to choose love over hate, hope over fear, and to contribute to the creation of a world that reflects our highest values.
It's a reminder that the kingdom of God isn't some far-off utopia, but something we can create here and now through our choices, our actions, and the way we choose to live our lives.
And I think that's a beautiful and empowering message to end on. Tolstoy challenges us to look inward, to awaken to the truth that resides within each of us, and to let that truth guide our every step as we navigate the complexities of life.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this today. The kingdom of God is within you. We hope it has provided you with some food for thought and perhaps even some inspiration for how to live a more meaningful and purposeful life. Remember, as Tolstoy said, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. So let's start with ourselves and see where that journey takes us.